Today's message is coming from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verses 21 to 34. And it reads, "They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching, because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Just then a man in their synagogue who was possessed by an impure spirit cried out, 'What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God.' 'Be quiet,' said Jesus sternly. 'Come out of him.' The impure spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. The people were all so amazed that they asked each other, 'What is this? A new teaching? And with authority. He even gives orders to impure spirits and they obey him.' News about him spread quickly all over the region of Galilee. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on him. That evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. So I did not realize this when we were planning our prayer of generosity, but our prayer of generosity pulls from the Heidelberg Catechism today. And if you know the first question and answer of the Heidelberg Catechism, the question of the first question is, what is your only comfort in life and death? Does anybody know the answer to that question? Yes, well done. Okay, we've got a few of you that got it. Yes, that I am not my own, but belong body and soul, in life and in death, to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. Now, depending on your relationship with the Christian faith, that may or may not resonate with you, actually. Admittedly, that statement for some might come off a little fanatical. You know, the idea, it's cool to have your religious beliefs. It's cool to go to church, whatever. But that kind of language, that we belong to anyone, for some is a little bit too much. But it's also the case that we do use some of that language in various ways for various relationships that we have. I belong to Angela as her husband. I belong to my children as their father. I belong to the members of this congregation as pastor here. But even though in some ways that's true, we also recognize that each one of those categories has very important limits. And so I belong to my wife differently than I belong to my children. I belong differently to my children than I do to the church. Why? Because each group determines the extent to which I belong. The relationship that I have to each of those entities determines the extent to which I belong to them. But what the Catechism highlights is that for the Christian, the way that we belong to Jesus has no limits because of who Jesus is. When we truly recognize his significance, we realize that the only proper response to him is full and complete devotion. That we are his body and soul in life and in death. And specifically, the authority that Jesus has, that we just heard about in this passage and that we're going to consider more today, means it's a reminder to us that there cannot be a tepid, half-hearted, arm's-length relationship to Jesus. And if there is, we don't actually truly know who he is. Now today, we're going to be continuing our slow-paced series through the fast-paced book of Mark. And throughout this series, we've been considering the idea of Jesus as a king and looking at his kingdom. And our passage today really emphasizes the authority that Jesus possesses as a king. In realizing what we're going to see is that we really do, when we see him for the person that he is, that we really ought to belong to him, body and soul, in life and death. And so what I want to do today is look at 4 different types of authority that we see in Jesus, 4 different types of authority that he possesses, as a way to determine whether or not we actually believe him to be who the Scripture tells him tells us that he is. We see him with an authority over three things that we'll look at today. An authority over truth. We see him as an authority over the spiritual. I'm sorry, I lied. It is four things. Over truth, over the spiritual, over sickness and death, and then finally, he has an authority over all. All right, let's look at those four things as a way to assess the extent to which we rightly understand who Jesus is. So first, an authority over truth. Before we jump into that, let's just quickly survey where we've been. Recap. Thus far, we have seen that Jesus, he has come in Mark proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. Right? This kingdom comes as a result of his arrival. We have seen that he is called the Messiah, the Christ, the one that Israel had been awaiting for years. The Messiah would come, they believed, to restore God's people, to bring liberation and salvation to God's people. However, as we've seen thus far in our series, the king and the kingdom didn't quite align with the expectations of those in that day, especially because they were in many ways expecting a political or a military figure to come. In some ways, they expected a genie in a bottle that was going to come and provide for them the things that they had already predetermined that they wanted. And last week we saw that Jesus, he has come not just for the salvation of individuals, which he very much has, but also we saw that he has come to restore all things, to restore the cosmos, to bring the cosmos back into order, to be the one who sets into motion the fullness of God's justice and mercy and righteousness. And that these ideas of justice and mercy and righteousness, they're not just implications of the gospel, but they're actually central to what Jesus is accomplishing in the gospel. And Jesus then calls his followers to proclaim that holistic gospel in both word and in deed. Now that brings us now to our passage. Jesus has now entered into Capernaum, and he begins to teach. And what we see is the very first reason why Jesus is worthy of our whole lives, body and soul. Look again at verse 21. Let me just reread that for us. It says that he went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. So Jesus comes and he starts teaching with this authority that no one else seemed to possess. His communication of truth transcended anything that they'd heard from anybody else. Now that word authority in many ways is a synonym for power, which we often use it in that way. But the original word literally means out of the original stuff. It's of course where we get the word author. And one biblical commentator puts it this way, and I thought it was very helpful in understanding what Mark's emphasizing. It says that Mark means that Jesus taught about life with, let me reread that. Mark means that Jesus taught about life with original rather than derived authority. That's a key part. Jesus is teaching with original rather than derived authority. He didn't just clarify something that they already knew or simply interpreted the scriptures in the way that the teachers of the law did. His listeners sensed somehow that he was explaining the story of their lives as the author, and it left them dumbfounded. In other words, Mark is telling us that Jesus is teaching God's law as the one who wrote God's law. In other words, Jesus is teaching as the creator of this law. He is teaching as the one who is the truth of God's law. I know we come back to this all the time, but this is what John is getting at in John 1, the Gospel of John, chapter 1, when he calls Jesus the Word. And if you remember the word, that word logos in Greek philosophy was the logic of the universe. It was the principle that ordered and governed the cosmos. And John says that Jesus is that logic, that Jesus is that principle that orders the cosmos. And that this logos has become flesh in Jesus. And Mark here is getting at the same thing. Truth, reality is Jesus. So when I say that Jesus has authority over truth, I am not saying that somehow Jesus controls truth, but rather everything that is true is rooted in Jesus. He is the author of what is true. The mathematical equations that some of us love, I'm not particularly one of them, but some of you love math. I know you do. They are true. Those equations are true because of Jesus. The medical procedures that heal our body, the discoveries of science, the experiences of love and desire for what is just and righteous, the presence of beauty and pleasure in this life, whatever is true, whatever is understandable about this universe, Jesus. Jesus is the reason. And though we can, of course, many do, reject and deny Jesus' truth, we can nonetheless know truth. But that is fundamentally different than knowing the source of that truth, which is Jesus. I mean, this is the great irony of atheistic or agnostic, humanistic, scientific materialism. There is so much that we can discover that is absolutely true about the world and the universe in which we live. But that is only because Jesus is the author of the truth that is discovered. We are not arbiters of truth. Truth is not found within us. Truth is not negotiable in a post-truth world where feelings and emotions so often trump facts, where misinformation and disinformation run rampant, where claims of alternative facts are justification for lies. We need to find some anchor in that storm. And if we're going to make any sense of life and reality, we must recognize ultimately the source of all truth. And according to Mark, Jesus is not just some perspective amongst various perspectives on truth. Jesus is actually, in his person, truth. And so if you're here and you're struggling to know what is true, to know what is just and righteous, what is honorable, look to Jesus. Because every leader, every philosopher, every thinker, every influencer, every commentator, every pastor, at some point will fail you in their claims of truth. Jesus, as truth, never will. And when we realize this about Jesus, how can we have a tepid, half-hearted, arm's length relationship to him? When we recognize Jesus as truth, we recognize he is worthy of our whole selves, body and soul. But not only does he possess authority over truth, we also see that he has authority over the spiritual. Look at what happens next in verse 23. Just then a man in their synagogue who was possessed by an impure spirit cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." "Be quiet," said Jesus sternly. "Come out of him." The impure spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. The people were all so amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching and with authority." He even gives orders to impure spirits, and they obey him. News about him spread quickly over the whole region in Galilee. I'll stop there. So not only do we see this crowd that has amassed, amazed by what Jesus taught, but we also see that they're amazed at the authority and the power that Jesus has over demons. Now, there's a few things to note about what we're seeing here and about demons in general. The first thing is to say that in contemporary times, I do think we often struggle with the notions of the spiritual, of demons, of impure spirits, or whatever we want to call them. And the superstitious nature of many has created a bit of a backlash, I think, against the notions of demons and the supernatural. There are even some Christians who want to deny what is happening in passages like this. So for example, for some, when they read passages like this, their answer to what's going on here is that these are ancient, archaic people who didn't know about things like mental illness. And so what we're seeing here is Mark really just describing what we now know and understand to be mental illness. And there's really nothing spiritual going on there. But to be fair, I will say, I say this with all love, Christians can be very superstitious and ascribe way too much to the demonic. And as a result, that superstition, it can bring some doubt about what the Bible claims on issues like this. There are absolutely cases, and frankly, I've seen them, where someone is struggling with mental health, and then they are treated as though they have a demon. And I can say unequivocally that that is absolutely wrong, and that should not be happening. But that does not mean, because that does happen, it does not mean that also we have a very real spiritual enemy that has set his face against God's creation, including against humanity. It is a very real world. You know, when Paul speaks about this in Ephesians 6, Ephesians 6 is talking about this malignant spiritual realm. It's a realm that we shouldn't take lightly. You know, it doesn't mean that we need to obsess over this malignant reality, and it's a bit of a side note, but I will say, I've spent years around people who, yes, they see demons around every corner. They try to rebuke demons that might have attached themselves to Goodwill items before they bring those Goodwill items into their home. They assume that demons are involved in their inability to be successful. Every disagreement that they have with someone else, they see as a demonic attack. We've been rebuked for giving out candy on Satan's holiday, giving out candy during costumes and candy on Halloween night. I mean, there's a lot, which, by the way, drives my wife crazy. It's the one time a year when our entire neighborhood is coming open-handed to the church, wanting us to put something in their hands. I think that'd be a really bad, or that'd be a huge wasted opportunity. That's a bit of a side note. We can talk more about that later. But I know people, yes, that talk more about demons than they talk about grace. But though that's the case, we nonetheless must realize we have a spiritual enemy, and that is what Mark is trying to show us. So that's the first thing. But the second thing to take away here, given that reality exists, that we have this enemy, the second thing to notice is that though there is this very real enemy, the presence of Christ completely neutralizes the enemy's power. Look at verse 24. Immediately, when Jesus arrives, the Spirit says through this man, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." The Spirit, of course, then recognizes Jesus, immediately recognizes Jesus' authority, and then immediately, when Jesus commands the Spirit to be silent and to leave, that's exactly what happens. Jesus has all authority over this spiritual realm. So lest we turn Jesus into some kind of philosophical abstraction like the Greek philosophers might have done with this notion of logos, or lest we assume that Jesus is just a really great teacher, as many of course do, Jesus is also one who holds ultimate power over the spiritual realm. And so if you're here and you are wrestling through some kind of spiritual battle, know that Jesus' presence, a presence that is with you, Christian, by the presence of the Spirit, is no match for legions of demons. They cannot stand against the power of Christ. And also, if you are here, and maybe some of us find ourselves in this situation, maybe some of us here, we have doubted that power, that authority that Jesus has. And as a result, you have looked for other sources of power through mediums, horoscopes, crystals, superstitious rituals, the occult. First, know that these are grievous affronts to the one who holds all power and authority. There are two sources of spiritual power. One is rooted in Jesus, and one is rooted in Satan. My encouragement, friends, would be to look to Christ alone. Find real spiritual freedom in the power and the authority that Jesus possesses. And ultimately, the whole point of this is when we realize that kind of authority, that kind of power that Jesus has, how can we have a tepid, half-hearted, arm's length relationship with him? How can we not see him as the one worthy of our whole lives, body and soul, in life and death? Third thing that we see Jesus having authority over, not just truth, not just the spiritual realm, but also over sickness and death. Look at verse 29. So as soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. There are three important realities concerning Jesus' authority here over sickness and death. The first is this. I want to emphasize how important it is that we see how tangible Jesus' presence is. Everything that we have said thus far about Jesus feels very intangible. Jesus as truth feels abstract. Jesus as ruler over the spiritual feels ethereal. And to be fair, again, there's many who would view Jesus in this way. Jesus is a good idea. Jesus is otherworldly, sure. Both are true. But what we see in this healing is that Jesus is concerned not just about truth, not just concerned about the spiritual, but Jesus also really cares about the physical world. In Jesus, the logic of the universe, the ruler of the cosmos, he's a physical being who is concerned about other physical beings. We cannot abstract Jesus and still have the Jesus of the Bible. Jesus is physical and cares about the physical. He's tangible. But the second thing to notice here is that we also see Jesus as not only concerned about the physical, but Jesus also has authority over the physical. What more authority over the physical world could one possess than to have authority over sickness and death? I mean, this is, of course, not the only time in this passage. It's not the only time that we see Jesus with this kind of authority. You know, over and over again, we see that Jesus would heal those who are sick and disabled. He would raise Jairus' daughter and Lazarus from the dead. We see that he has authority over life and death. And this is why, friends, we pray for healing. We believe in a God that heals. That is why every month we have healing prayer with our elders. It's not some perfunctory thing. It's a faith-filled thing. We believe that God can heal. The same Jesus who healed Simon's mother-in-law is the same Jesus who can still do it again today. And there are many with testimonies of miraculous healing. You know, there are those whose cancer disappears. There are those who have had their sight and their healing restored. There are those who were once had unusable limbs that were then strengthened. I remember a story my grandmother used to tell me, and she was probably, by the way, the most godly woman I have ever known in my whole life. But she once told me a story from her youth, where she watched her aunt, I guess my great aunt, while my great aunt was cutting vegetables, the knife slipped and it cut her finger clean off. And my aunt then grabbed this detached finger, stuck it back on, prayed for healing, and it immediately reattached. I will say, I have zero reason to not believe that my godly grandmother absolutely saw this happen right in front of her eyes. And if anyone wants to call my grandmother a liar, we're going to have some words. I believe this happened. And if Jesus is who he says he is, if he really does have authority over sickness and death, of course that is absolutely possible. And so if you're here and divine healing seems like the only thing left, medicine and doctors have done all that they can do. And we thank God for the marvelous truths discovered in medicine, right? Truths rooted in Jesus, back to our first point. But I want you to also know that you can have faith and trust that if Jesus wants to bring healing, he has the power to do so. And so it's okay to pray bold prayers. But there's a third thing to notice about Jesus' power and authority, is that he also has sovereignty over the physical. Simon's mother-in-law, right, the one we're reading about here in this passage, Jesus heals her, and yet she eventually dies. Jairus' daughter, Lazarus, they were raised from the dead. But both of them also eventually died. There comes a point, even if Jesus intervenes with miraculous healing, death will still come. And the reason this is important to name is because though Jesus healed many, he did not heal anyone who came to him permanently. And there were many he did not heal at all. There were many more sick than what we read about in the Gospels. Though Jesus raised some people from the dead, many also stayed dead. In the sovereignty of God's perfect will and purposes, he may or may not bring that temporary healing. In knowing that this is the case, our bold prayers for healing, prayers that we should be praying, must also be couched in a trust of the goodness of God, regardless of what he does or does not do. We have, of course, referenced this many times, but the prayer of Jesus before he goes to the cross, it really is the quintessential prayer of one who is both bold but also trusting in a prayer. Jesus knowing what was to come, the burden and the sorrow of the cross, Jesus prays that famous prayer, "Father, let this cup pass from me." It's a bold prayer. But then he says, "Yet not my will, but yours be done." A bold yet trusting prayer. God, I believe that you can heal me. I believe that you can raise people from the dead. And so would you let this cup of sickness pass from me? Yet not my will, but yours be done. This is the kind of prayer Jesus presents to us that is both bold and trusting. We can boldly believe that God is able to heal and trust him even when the healing doesn't come. And we also need to remember, that God doesn't answer Jesus' prayer the way that one might expect. We're talking about the Son of God here. If there's anyone who has more faith in what God is able to do, nobody could compare it to Jesus. And yet, God does not answer Jesus' prayer. We would expect that Jesus would have prayed this very bold prayer and that the cup would have passed from him, but it didn't. And despite his prayer, a prayer of bold faith, it still, nonetheless, led him to death on the cross. Why? Because what God intended through the cross and the eventual resurrection is the whole point of Jesus' proclamation of the gospel of the kingdom, which leads us finally to the authority that Jesus has over all things. We get a glimpse, a little bit of a foreshadowing of something that kind of pulls all of this together in verse 32. Let's look again at the passage. It says, "That evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus," this is what I want to highlight, people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. Here's what strikes me about that verse 32. It is a foreshadowing of something that is ultimate. There is something to be said about the fact that everyone who came to Jesus experienced Jesus, and in some way experienced the freedom and the healing that he possesses. Now, of course, like I said, the experience of healing that many experienced then still led to death. But because Jesus goes to the cross, because the Spirit of God raises Jesus from the dead, because Jesus ascends and he's seated at the right hand of the Father, because he rules and reigns over a kingdom of restoration, and because he promises to one day return, all who come to the resurrected Jesus, yes, might experience the sting of death like he did, but will also experience the resurrection life that he experienced. All who come to him will one day be healed. All who come to him will be freed fully and completely. All who come to him will experience the fullness of that kingdom of restoration. All who come and trust this restoration is God's ultimate purpose. There might be aspects of experiencing measures of it now, but the point of what Jesus has accomplished is he's accomplishing the permanent nature of this resurrection power, the permanent nature of full and complete restoration. So the question is this: have you come to Jesus? And I don't mean some version of Jesus. I mean the Jesus who is the Logos, the truth, the very logic of the universe. I mean the Jesus whose very presence causes demons to flee. I mean the Jesus who holds life and death and has conquered death in order to provide his people healing and freedom. Have you come to that Jesus? Friends, when we see Jesus in this way, the kind of authority that Jesus has, how can we have, again, a tepid, half-hearted, arm's-length relationship to him? We can't. It doesn't make sense. Of course he is worthy of our whole lives. Of course he is worthy of our whole devotion. Of course we belong to him body and soul because of this authority that he possesses. What are the response? Even makes sense when we see him for who he truly is. And so know that Jesus is calling you to himself, promising that all that come will one day experience the fullness of his resurrection power. So come to him. Come to him truly. See him truly for who he is. Give your body, or give your whole life, your body and soul, to him fully and completely, for we belong to him alone. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the great power that we see in Jesus, the authority that we see in Jesus. It's matchless. There's no one that can compare. And yet, though that is the case, and he rules and reigns over all things, as we're just reminded, he's also near and close, and intimately cares about all that's going on in our lives. So much so that he has taken upon himself the weight of the cross, the consequence of our sin, the brokenness of this world. He's taken it upon himself. And he has plunged that sickness, that death, that sin, plunged it into permanent destruction, rising again with resurrection power, and has extended that resurrection and restoration to those who trust in him. And so, would you remind us of the fullness of who he is? Each one of us struggles in various ways to see Jesus rightly. And so remind us of the places where we have not seen him in the ways that we should. For the next